No, do they start the debate at LO? We think it's important to recognize that India's decision to block the TFA was not one motivated by things like food security or grain stockpiling, that these were things that could have been done, or there could have been other measures that could have been done to protect the people in this debate. We think that it was, at the end of the day, a political move that was used to protect farmers and their livelihoods. But we think there were other ways by which this could have been done, and that's why we're very happy to say that we regret India's decision to block the TFA. So what were the things in the TFA that was particularly contentious? So first and foremost, that there was a limit on the amount of agricultural subsidy that could have been in place, a maximum of 10%, which was, a large adjustment or a large change from the current amount that India subsidizes. We're very happy to say that there was a time frame involved. They could have had time to adjust this subsidy. It's like no big deal. It wasn't like an overnight thing. So what do we want to do? With the two things we want to prove in this debate. First and foremost, that the TFA would have been something that was beneficial to India, and second of all, that would have been beneficial to the rest of the world and the agriculture market as a whole. First of all, why would it have been good for India? Because we recognize that to some extent, right, there was ability for India to already do the things it does for individuals in the status quo, which is to buy rice and give it to them. The alternative in the status quo would be simple, that you give money to these individuals to buy rice so that you don't alter the price or convert basically any money that you're going to subsidize into giving these people rice. So pretty much the price level doesn't really change for them. No, thank you. But what do we think the problem in the status quo is that there's a huge amount of wastage because of inefficient production and rice that fundamentally doesn't sell. No, thank you. We think the problem here is this, that at the point at which you subsidize production, you create a large amount of waste, like the grain that eventually doesn't sell, doesn't go anywhere, is kept in a warehouse and burnt or turned into manure for no good reason except for the fact that it was subsidized and therefore were efficient to produce at that point. No, thank you. We think therefore there's a huge amount of cash that could have been spent elsewhere, subsidizing actual people's needs and actual people's welfare, instead of spending money on rice that sat in a warehouse for the entirety of its duration. We think the problem here is not just with wasteful production, but with wasteful expenditure as well, when people are forced to, or when the government is forced to buy up this rice in order to make sure that farmers continue to have the kind of sustainable income. No, thank you. But we think the second problem here with wastage is that there's a lot of inertia or inefficiency because small farmers especially don't want to move towards more efficient ways of farming, purchasing tractors or whatever, in order to produce the kinds of no thank you, the things that have or create more efficient farming environments, or even doing things like piling land together so that it's more efficient and things like that. We think the problem with this is exactly the same as creating unnecessarily high prices of rice that don't contribute or don't help the situation or agricultural field in any way. No, thank you. But we think the second thing that would have benefited India is that we think there would have been cheaper prices as a result of this. Because now in the status quo, the ability for foreign brands to compete on the same level as Indian grains is extraordinarily limited. We think what changes when we adopt this policy is that we give the ability for foreign brands to compete to even more closely to the Indian grain, which gives the ability makes the rice market more competitive, thus eventually driving prices down. Yes, closing.
So you're saying that these farmers don't buy tractors and don't improve their equipment because they're stupid, not because they don't get enough subsidies and live in poverty?
We think it's simple, right? You can't indefinitely subsidize them. The only solution that is viable, economically speaking, is to have them pile their resources together to buy a fucking tractor. We don't think there's an issue with, we don't think you can subsidize every poor farmer on the market. No, thank you. In order to have them all have tractors, right? But the last thing, right, is that we think it increases the level of the kinds of competition that take place, right, in this market. And we think this is necessarily a good thing. We think farmers are insulated from competition in the status quo because they make up large amounts of voting blocks and constitute a lot of political power in some northeastern Indian states. No, thank you. We think this is problematic for a number of reasons. First and foremost, because we think it creates false senses of security within this market. And we think that's extraordinarily problematic in the sense that it gives, or the costs of it are borne out by the everyday Indian consumer. We think this is extraordinarily harmful, and it's something that the Indian government needs to move away from. So we think it's better to have these individuals compete on a slightly more level playing field with the rest of the world's grains. No, thank you. And we think it's essentially something that's going to not only benefit like Indian farmers first and foremost, but the economy and the individuals in this Indian society. No, thank you. But let's look at the second area, right? Why would the rest of the world benefit from this? No, thank you. We think the problem here is this: that in a lot of other places which are trying to export rice to India, that people don't experience the same level of welfare, the same level of subsidies that Indian farmers do. They don't experience the same kind of mobility that like individuals in India have. No, thank you. We think the problem here is this: that at the point at which you close off an entire billions worth of people of market, the problem you create is even worse. That India is entrenching its position, like India is entrenching its own like farmers at the cost of the rest of the world's farmers, which we think is something that's not necessarily fair. We think that in this circumstance, like India as like a giant economy has a responsibility to like try and buy rice from other economies, because we think, no thank you, that at the end of the day, there's something that's necessarily beneficial not just to India, but to the rest of the world as well. We think therefore that India's decision to block the TFA was one that was motivated A, by selfish political gains that's not actually the actual needs of the people on the ground. But last of all, why do we think that India, even if like India doesn't have any sort of responsibility, that blocking the TFA was something that was detrimental? Because because we think that it sets the kinds of precedents that against kind of industries or kind of international agreements entering India, right? Because we think individuals want to engage India, or international organizations and MNCs, they do want to engage India because there's a very large market. We think the problem with closing yourself off is that you close yourself off from opportunities and investment as well. We think the problem, especially given that the agricultural field is such a large one for India, we think it's necessary that it can receive the kind of foreign direct investment so that it doesn't have to spend as much money on these kinds of like subsidies. And for all these reasons, we're very proud to propose.
I think that's it for that my speech, and I'll open the motion to open the case for the rest of the hearing. The Prime Minister came up and gave a very generous speech against protectionism. We think in these circumstances you have to look at the situation within India, the financial situation that they're in, the poverty that they have to face, and how they overcome it. And we're going to do that from opening opposition. Before I move on to my two argumentations, two questions for side opening government. Number one, is the TFA beneficial to India? But number two, is the TFA beneficial to the entire world? First question, is the TFA beneficial to India? We have three responses, because their first contention was that they are wasting too many crops, and that in itself is dangerous to begin with. That's why it's a bad investment to do so. Are you telling me the nation that's suffering from poverty is going to waste all the food that they have and burn it and make manure? We don't think that's happening in Sedisco. They're going to use it because they don't have anything else to eat, Mr. Speaker. But secondly, they told us that small farmers don't want to change and they have no incentive to change. Firstly, they could change if they had the money to. If they don't have the money, then they can't buy tractors to make their farms better. But number two, that is not sensitive to the government change in India. Narendra Modi, who is from Gujarat, who is very business friendly, wants to economize wants to make India a better economy and make the economy within India flourish, just like how they made it in Gujarat. If he did it in the past with Gujarat, he will do it again in the future when India is ready to accept this policy, not when they are unsustainable and not ready. But then the third response that we have is that they told us it's better and it's important for Indian farmers to compete with foreign farmers because that's beneficial to them and competition is good. Sure, competition is beneficial in the event where you have the capacity to compete. You will lose out to foreign farmers because they have more capital. I'll explain this later why they are more powerful in this circumstance. We think there is no point in doing so. But secondly, we think, the second question that we ask is that whether or not TFA is beneficial to the whole world. Yeah, sure, it's very beneficial to have a free market and thus based it on quality, but in the situation within India where farmers don't have the ability to compete with these individuals, it's not context sensitive. But then they told us that, you know, there's political gain and then necessarily you can do so. What kind of political gain can you gain from when your economy is suffering and destroying? We don't think that necessarily happens in their model. But let's look at the two arguments. Number one, why is it perfectly legitimate for them to do so? Firstly, the World Trade Organization operates on a principle of free trade. Also, not just that, they also allow countries to come into the market and come on a level playing field with foreign direct investments who have the capacity to control the market based on a consensus. What does this mean? That means the World Trade Organization agrees that countries need to have some say when it comes to economic policies or economic barriers, whether or not they want to reduce or not. Right? They should have the autonomy to decide on agreeable or non-agreeable things within their own principles. Right? Another thing that the World Trade Organization does is that they separate in countries into different classes. What does this mean? It proves that they create accommodation for nations based on their own context and how they can fix the situation based on different classes that you fit in and how policies are accommodated for different types of countries and how that necessarily is beneficial. That means less developed countries are given allowance to sustain their own market or their own local market compared to the United States of America or Japan, where they have a booming agricultural local industry. The conclusion to this is that firstly, the World Trade Organization also agrees that the countries should be able to come to their own terms with reasonable grounds within status quo. But secondly, it's hypocritical to India to not make allowance for itself when America spends 456 million on its agricultural industry. We think that India doesn't have this capacity. We should allow them, give them the allowance to do so. No, thank you, right? We think it's not strange for India to reject this. I think the World Trade Organization also agrees to these kinds of principles. It's also very, very hand in hand with their own policy. Before I move on, I think, sure.
Exactly. So with this agreement, America will also be forced to export subsistence corn and wheat, things that Indian farmers can often sell at pretty much low prices than American farmers. Wouldn't it be dictators of Indian farmers to get that market?
I'll explain why foreign companies have bigger capacity to lower the prices of their products compared to a local farmer, because local farmers generally need more profit than a foreign company who has the ability to diversify its products to different nations, right? But let's look at my second argument. Why is it harmful to India to adopt the TPA at this particular moment in time? Because we understand that TPA is not always bad in these circumstances, but the context of India is necessarily harmful. But we think when India is sustainable, and as a sustainable local market, we think it's perfectly fine for them to adopt the TPA in some time in the future when Narendra Modi fixes it. But firstly, governments need to secure food security, and that is the utmost priority within every single nation. When their own country does not have a sustainable local market for food in itself, and they have over-dependence on foreign countries, that is dangerous. And we think that's a priority for nations to sustain and make sure that the survivability is the priority. But secondly, how will the insertion of MNCs or multinational corporations harm the local farmers to begin with? Firstly, MNCs or multinational corporations like Monsanto and Walmart are able to compete with the economy of scale. What does this mean? Because they have the ability to spend or have more profit because they sell their products in different countries or different places, and they have the ability to sell different types of products, they have more profit than an average local farmer in India. This means that they have the capacity to lower the price of their product within that market. That means people are more inclined to buy their product because they have the ability to make it cheaper and more available and accessible for more people. This doesn't happen to local farmers because no thank you. Why? Because most of local farmers in India are rural, they are from rural areas, they are poor, poverty is very rampant. There's two problems. Number one, they can't even get their product on the shop to begin with. But number two, they cannot have the ability to reduce the price just like MNCs and foreign direct investments who have the ability to do so. No thank you. Within the country is only able to adopt TPA also when the country has other industries or other available methods of ascertaining profit. For example, when the United States of America has the ability for other industries and other methods of getting profit, they can afford to adopt the TPA because they can cover up for the mess up that happens when you adopt the TPA. India doesn't really have that because India's primary focus is on agriculture. India's primary focus is on food and crops. No, thank you, sir. We think that also the economy works on a primary industry, secondary industry, and that's when you move to the middle income and you start manufacturing things. India is at the first stage, and we think that they really rely on agricultural. This creates a dependence on foreign markets because you allow foreign markets to make control over the monopoly within the local sphere of India. We think this is bad for a number of reasons. Firstly, in times of economic recession, or when the world is suffering from economic crisis, corporations like Walmart or MNCs have the ability to just ditch that country and leave the nation at that particular point in time because they're not ascertaining as much profit as they would have. This means it's dangerous for number one, because they already have such a huge dependence over those foreign countries. That means they'll be left in a horrible situation because they don't have the ability to sustain themselves on their own local markets. But number two, and most importantly, India's economy is perilous. What does this mean? In the event where it's a market, when you ditch them or when you leave the country because of an economic crisis or economic recession, there is a market shock because they are on the brink of industrialization and they're ready to leave the first stage of economy, but they're stuck there. This creates speculation on the Indian economy when it comes to foreign direct investments. When other countries want to trade with you, they can't have stigma that necessarily exists on your nation because your economy is deemed unsustainable, is dangerous for your own nation. If you want to create a sustainable local market that will still help you in the event where foreign companies ditch you, we think it's important that you will accept the policy.
Thank you. My speech and about financial
Mr. Speaker, I'm going to look at two things in my speech. I'm going to look at how India will now get access to larger markets, and that's good for the farmers. Then second, I'm going to look at how Indian consumers are better off because of the removal of wasteful subsidies that can be used for far more important things. Before that, let's deal with two things that were said by the speaker before me. The first one thing he said was that over-dependence on other countries is a dangerous thing. You should never depend on other countries for food. But the truth is, we live in a world of dependence. Countries depend on a lot of the other important things. For example, because of India, India's a net oil importing country. It needs to import oil from other countries to keep basically everything running. Its factories, its army, and the like. It buys weapons from America. Hence, it's dependent on America for survival against Pakistan. So if you can accept that, I don't see what's so wrong about depending on other countries as a whole, as long as two things are satisfied. A, you have a diversity of sources of supply. So if I buy rice from many countries, then it's likely that I'll reduce the risk of any harm happening. And secondly, India benefits too from depending on others. And this is what I'll establish earlier in my speech. Secondly, he argued that MNCs from America are going to come here and monopolize the Indian market. Look, India is huge. Like, it's about 1.2 billion people. I think it's impossible for Walmart to monopolize the rice market. I think this is impossible. I think it's for them to simply have lots of competition from the Chinese rice companies who are willing to come in, and through competition, you're going to get generally fair prices occurring. And the next thing I point out is that antitrust laws are still going to come into place. We are just going to force companies to behave competitively, so we don't see any issue there. Before I go on to my two main ideas, now I will go on to my two main ideas. Firstly, India get access to bigger markets, because this debate is also about two different paradigms. Like my first talk about how Indian farmers generally are just simply not doing a good job and they should back up. I want to how even if we should take their side, they're better off because now under our policy they get access to bigger markets elsewhere around the world. What are other markets? The TFA agreement is not a unilateral agreement where India says I give everything and you just take me like a prostitute. India gets things in return, right? It gets access to Damansara, to the corn market, it gets access to the wheat markets in America and in Canada. These places are places where you have plenty of consumers, but more importantly, higher purchasing power. The average white guy living in Arkansas is willing to pay you $5 for half a sack of rice, which can only be sold in India for a rupee, or somewhere around there. I'm sorry if I'm being offensive, I just really don't know what the rest are. But generally, you earn a lot more to sell them. So what does this mean? Indian farmers now can sell rice and other stuff that they grow, like potatoes, dal, whatever, to Americans at much higher prices. They earn greater incomes that allow them to progress. They can now send their kids to better schools instead of depending on the minimum small prices they get from the government. Even with the subsidies that they give right now, it's still very small. The Indian government pays a few rupees per sack, and it will not match the kind of prices that American consumers can pay if they got access. Yes, sir.
So you're saying that India should start exporting rice and dal to America when it can barely manage to feed its own population. Is that something that you're for?
No, I'm saying that if they access to a global market, they can choose sell more, and then with global competition, there are more options. That's what I'm getting at. Secondly, I'll point out to you, Ms. Speaker, that even the only response I heard, I mean, 2050 from the opening op was that, well, American MNCs are better, they are bigger, they're more sophisticated, hence they can sort of undercharge and underprice Indian farmers. Well, that's an argument for Indian farmers to simply buck up, right? To be less efficient, less inefficient, and move on to buying bigger parts of land. Things that my speaker talked about. The problem with subsidies is this: once you're on a subsidy, once you get a state guaranteed income, right? You have very inertia to try to mechanize. You have very inertia to try to modernize. Because I get welfare, like I'm bummed, right? Like we all love to be bummed if we could. Like I would if I could. But when you remove the guarantee of minimum price, then I start to think a lot harder. Like where I'm going to get my next bread and butter tomorrow. That's how you're going to get them engaging in the kind of economies of scale you only get when they combine the land and stop, using the damn chunk code and use, tractors. I know I'm from UP. I've been there many times. You see how they come over there. Now, my second argument, yes, sir.
So you're saying that Indian farmers are poor by choice, and they cannot afford to this farm.
No, they're not poor. Like they're okay, Like I mean, it's even like some of my friends in some parts of the world as well. Like they get income. They know as long as I grow so much fast, I'll get a certain income for certain. And I don't have to wonder about what my next day's wages will be. So they don't feel a need to do better. They don't feel a need to do better because it's a guaranteed income from the state. That's a bad thing. Now let's go into the second argument: Indian consumers. Now you see, there are two arguments to that. The first argument is that you see, if our policy allows, from this side of the house, still allows Indian households to get access to cheap rice. So if you're poor, you can still get access to welfare money from the government. But we're just not going to stress farmers in general. Why is that a good thing? It means the money the government spends on helping poor people is targeted. I'm only going to help poor Indian households. Right now, you're going to stress all rice that's sold to all families, rich, poor, which means a lot of money spent on subsidies that aren't needed. Like rich families in India don't need to buy subsidized rice. They can buy expensive rice and they can afford it, but the government is still subsidizing that, and that's wasteful. What's important? Because that money can be used for far better things. Like use it to fund, like you say, India's dying, is poor, right? So there are other things that can spend money on, like education, better roads. Like what's going on in Nigeria? I heard the other day, right? So Indian people are far better off because now the money is being used in a more efficient, targeted manner. Now, secondly, right, if it's so true that US MNCs can sell rice cheaper than Indian farmers, then that's good enough for Indian households. Because now Indian households can get access to cheap rice as opposed to be stuck, with the dirty busted rice that often comes to the doorstep. Yes, sir. Oh, sorry about that. Okay. All to that, because I would love to hear your point. Now, okay, so let me then summarize the debate, because that's what I'm doing now. So firstly, I've established that overdependence is not overdependence, it's just a concept, but the truth is, there's nothing wrong with depending on other countries for food. Secondly, we argue that MNCs are not going to monopolize India because it's too hard, it's too large. Thirdly, I've shown to you that Indian farms are going to be far better off because now they're going to be a lot more competitive and a lot more efficient, and they can sell more now and get access to bigger markets out there. Thirdly, I've shown that Indian consumers are better off because now the subsidies that are spent on rice can be used on far more important like education, health, and road building and the like, and also to get access to cheaper options. And how about this? A wider variety of options. But this is a great thing. I can buy rice from America because sometimes American rice is different in taste. I want to try that as well. I think just simply with the fact they get more variety is in itself a benefit that consumers love. Be back to propose.
Ladies and gentlemen, we think opening government has a vicious and an untrue representation about what Indian farmers face from day to day. We think a great majority of individuals in India not only face poverty, but also the inability to send their children to school and the ability to only function on basic functions that are hard labor, things like working at the local construction site or working in a local farm that have been passed down through families. That's how they have social mobility that they want on opening government. The way forward is to ensure that maybe not this generation, but maybe 3 generations on, that those families are able to send their kids to school. And believe me, they're not the lazy middle-income people that don't want to buy their tractors and don't want to become rich. They're just like you and I, Mr. Speaker. People want to make a living, and people want to send their kids to school so that they can actually move out of the very, very difficult job of tending to farms, plowing fields, and which are generally not pleasant jobs to do, ladies and gentlemen. We think it was very unrealistic for opening government to just simply tell us that they just wanted to stay as farmers because they don't have anything to worry about. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to be talking about two things in my speech. Number one, I'm going to respond to a lot of things that Ashok talked about in his speech in regards to how do we keep India competitive and ensure that there's a diversification in terms of markets and ensure that in the long term that we don't keep on with the kind of toxic subsidization of markets that we have right now. And secondly, I'll tell you why food security is an extreme and a very important issue when it comes to international corporations, especially when you have corporations like Monsanto buying out your farms in India, and why that's important. Firstly, let's talk about how do we ensure long-term sustainability when it comes to competition. Number one, I think that Ashok was very dismissive to the kind of analysis that came from Roshan's speech. What did he tell you? To be sensitive to the kind of regime change that just happened in India, Narendra Modi, ladies and gentlemen, runs on a campaign where it's very business friendly. That's why it seems quite strange that he employs tactics like government subsidies onto agricultural industries. But the funny thing that people don't know is that he employed government subsidies at the early on stages of his regime in Gujarat, ladies and gentlemen, gradually changing it to more business friendly approaches. What does this mean? That means there is an actual top-down approach in terms of political will, in terms of taking away subsidies from farmers. In fact, only recently, Narendra Modi has already introduced multiple health as well as regulatory standards in terms of how farmers are supposed to create their crops, which inadvertently make it more expensive for them, but also increase the quality for consumers all around. That means there's a great political will and push for it to ensure not only the quality that you want, diversity, but to ensure that in the long term, people are not hung up on the subsidies that you want on this side of the house, ladies and gentlemen. That means in the long term, ladies and gentlemen, if your concern really is competitiveness as well as the ability for you to ensure that farmers are not stuck with subsidies, we think it's already happening right now. We think there's a long-term push to ensure that that push continues in the future. But before I go on to my second substantive, yes sir.
Let's start. Can you tell me why India is in a better position right now after rejecting an international agricultural agreement?
Ladies and gentlemen, it's not like they've just become partner to the WTO and only started reducing their tariffs right now. The reason why the TPA is so controversial is because it requires India to radically and drastically tear down their tariffs as well as their subsidies overnight, ladies and gentlemen. And that's completely different from the kind of principle that the WTO stands for in regards to the consensus of individual members and the fact that individual members can take their time to come into the middle and ensuring that their regulatory standards meet the other on the other side of the room. This is a drastic measure by the international community. That's why it's been rejected by India, ladies and gentlemen. Secondly, let's talk about why food security is so fundamentally important when it comes to ensuring people can survive. Number one, we're very willing to concede that India's food production is not optimal. Of course, there's no wastage, ladies and gentlemen. They barely have enough food. But we can concede that it's not optimal, and sometimes they don't have enough food. But why are we willing to suffer in the short term in this instance, ladies and gentlemen? Because we've seen many examples when England faced the food crisis back in the 1900s, ladies and gentlemen. They were willing to do so and buy food from Asian countries, but also heavily subsidized agriculture in the UK. In fact, if you go to the UK right now, you'll find that local agricultural products are perfectly labeled and they're subsidized and they're much cheaper than foreign products. The reason for that, ladies and gentlemen, is because though it's true that we are dependent on some countries for some products like military and things like that, the difference is with food, that's the most fundamental industry in comparison to any other industries. That determines whether or not your people have the ability to go to work or not, the ability to carry those guns, the ability on whether or not you should be able to survive as a country or not. Oftentimes productivity is limited based on the amount of food security that you have. Riots are oftentimes correlated with whether or not people have food security or not. So sure, you may be able to buy from loads of other different countries when it comes to guns, and it's okay for you to be dependent on that, or you may not have guns at all like Japan. But one thing that you need to have in any circumstance is food, because anybody can live without guns, but nobody can live without food, ladies and gentlemen. That's why you need to have food self-sustenance in this instance. Secondly, Even if we're going to talk about monopoly and the ability to have antitrust law under the side of government. Ladies and gentlemen, let's look at the demographic that we're talking about here. We're talking about rural poor farmers that are supposed to go to Supreme Courts in the United States of America or local courts to be able to battle out against multinational billion-dollar corporations in antitrust suits that barely even succeed in America. What less in India, ladies and gentlemen? Do you expect the local farmer to be able to know the nooks and crannies of antitrust law? And in this instance, we think that you only victimize the rural poor in this debate, ladies and gentlemen. That means your regulations disproportionately victimize the poor. Thirdly, if you're going to talk about the diversification, for example, India is able to have access to corn, wheat, and all these markets that the TPA opens for them. Sure, we agree that that's a benefit, only insofar that the rural poor can capitalize on those opportunities, ladies and gentlemen. If you loosen up subsidies and people don't get their tractors, people aren't able to pay for their farms and aren't able to foster the next generation of farmers through their kids or whatnot, that means they are less able to capitalize on the market of wheat or whatever market opportunity you're opening up on, because they can't get their food to the shop. They can't get their food to the shipping lodge overseas. That means it's less able for them to capitalize on those things. But lastly, we think the biggest harm in this debate, and they need to respond to, is that companies like Monsanto and Walmart buy out local farmers' farms once they go bankrupt. That means there's a disproportionate possibility that companies will try to make you more dependent on them in the future and beholden and behest at their demands. We are very proud to oppose.
In opening half, you heard the benefits and the cons of the trade facilitation agreement. This debate, however, is an evaluation of whether India was strategic in rejecting the TFA. That means it's not an evaluation of the TFA in and of itself, but it's an evaluation of whether India was right to reject the TFA. Let's talk about 4 things that were not privy, obviously, to the themes so far. The first, the Trade Facilitation Agreement is a subsidiary of the World Trade Organization. That means even if you are a signatory of the WTO, that doesn't mean you're immediately a signatory of the TFA. The TFA is an international binding agreement that was recently signed at the Bali package, somewhere early this year or late last year. There are 2 points of contention with the TFA. The first is that there is a 10% cap on the subsidy each member states are allowed to give to their farmers based on the amount of profits you make from the sale of your grapes. The second thing is contentious is international agreements by the WTO, as long as it's signed by member states, which India signed the TFA, is that they are susceptible to the peace clause. That means, and that will be further explained in my extension. 2 nuances that this debate forgot. First is that India signed the TFA and backed out after receiving interim funds from the United States of America and the WTO. The fourth nuance is that India recently passed into law the Food Security Act. That means Modi and his group and his gang already promised millions of Indians that high subsidies will be granted to the farmers of India. And if they do that, they are trapped into the peace clause, and they'll be breaching the TFA. That's why India didn't want to sign the TFA, go through with it. The debate in opening was an evaluation of whether the TFA was a good thing or not about whether India was right in rejecting the TFA. Let's talk about responses. The opening up wanted to talk about the back effects of the TFA, but I already preambled to you that this debate is not about that. It's a debate about balance of harms. India is still going to receive several levels of harms by rejecting, but we think the harms are a lot better than what you do under the opposition. 2 points of substantive that they said. Food security is important. We agree. The analysis was that England did it in the early 90s, so why not India too? Well, England wasn't a signatory to the TFA. They weren't breaching anything. There was no repercussions. Sit down. Walmart, they say, will still have the enormous ability to buy out failing farmers. They will still have that ability under your model. You don't change that. Let's look at our extensions. Sit down. Firstly, on a balance, it's a lot more harmful that if India went through with the TFA. Let me tell you why. India is heavily dependent on international trade and exchange in technology when it comes to the agriculture. That's why the United States are happy to opt into the TFA, because they get a lot, they're able to give out more subsidies to their farmers because their facilities and technology are able to produce a lot more. Because remember, the TFA's clause is that 10% of your surplus from the sale of your grain. That's why the United States are happy to it. The only way India can gain from this if they continue to stay in the TFA and they gain the technology, but they chose to opt out of it. Second thing to remember, that rejecting the TFA, it activates something called the peace clause. What is the peace clause? The peace clause allows for countries to place legitimately trade sanctions, embargoes on the goods and sales that India has and can provide. When India chose to reject the TFA, they opened themselves up to the peace clause breach. That means all the country member states of the WTO are now legitimately allowed to embargo and place sanctions on India. India's a lot more harmed under that. Third harm is that other countries will continue to expand with better investments because there's more pool of the subsidies to go around because India is out of the picture. The last harm is it's a continuance from the preamble I gave you earlier. There is now no exchange of technology when it comes to the agriculture from the United States. So United States will still be a TFA member and will still be able to profit because they have huge amounts of it. But India won't be able to receive that technology or the exchange because they've opted out of the TFA. Sit down. Let's now look at the converse. What are the harms that India would have suffered, and is the balance justified? Before I move on, I'll take from opening.
Number one.
One POI.
Why can't India benefit from the technological exchange to other means other than the trade that you suggest? And in that
Okay.
still benefit.
Great, very good. So if I'm in a shipping agreement, if I get any technology from the shipping industry, I'll use it for the shipping industry. If I don't I'm not included in an agriculture agreement, and if I opt out of it, no one's going to give me technology in regards to the agriculture department. That's why people don't share technology around Mevzal. It's limited and they use it specifically for their industries. Sit down. Why did India reject it? Modi promised the Indian people that he would be able to mete out huge amount of farming subsidies for a large amount of farmers. Why? That's why they passed the Food Securities Act. You cannot say this is not true. Sit down, right? You cannot say that the Food Security Act is not true and what it promises is not true. It exists, and that is why Modi rejected it. Given that he did reject it, what is important to remember here is that he will lose political leverage. And those were the specific reasons why he did, right? Those were the specific reasons why he rejected the TFA. Given that he rejected the TFA, what is so bad? We're willing to accept that Modi and his political party would have lost political leverage because they didn't go through with the Food Security Act. Nevertheless, what are the benefits? Even though very angry because they don't receive their farm subsidies, in the long run, they have a lot to gain because the hearts and minds of the Indian people will be gained back. And in the long run, you get the transfer of technology. You get the ability to trade within the TFA. You get the ability to not be sanctioned because of the peace clause. You get the ability to transfer and distribute more of this technology because you're not susceptible to the peace clause anymore. But because India chose to block the TFA, because India chose to put the Indian people in a harsher position and open them up to attacks in an economic arena, the debate that we've evaluated is whether or not we should regret the decision of blocking the TFA, not the TFA in and of itself. India already knew the pros and cons of the TFA. We are very happy to win this debate.
Ready? Yeah. First things first, let me clear up a few factual mistakes on the part of Siron. Narendra Modi has not promised Indians the food security bill. The Indian National Congress, in its last few days in power, promised this bill as a populist measure in order to get elected. It did not succeed, but that does not mean that they could just repeal the bill, given that it was a populist measure and was met with quite well by the public. So that's why, Mr. Speaker, even if you were to assume his analysis, Narendra Modi went ahead and rejected the TFA because he was left with that bill that he could not repeal because he would lose a massive amount of populist support, although it is foisted upon him by the Congress, Mr. Speaker. So we don't think it's something that Narendra Modi is doing out of some, like, nefarious plot to, somehow like undermine the USA, Mr. Speaker. Secondly, on this, I'll just move on straight to my rebuttals because I really will deal with the speech in my substantives. First of all, on the idea of OG came out with this interesting proposal. They said that we're going to take the subsidies from the farmer and pay people so that they can buy rice. So that's why the prices won't get affected. First of all, you're actually conceding, therefore, that the prices of rice will increase, and for the average consumer, that's problematic. We don't think there's anything more we need to explain there. But secondly, it's quite simple, right? Who actually gets left out as a result of this policy? It's the farmer, right? It's that rural poor Indian farmer, which they have on both benches completely failed to analyze the effect of this policy on in terms of how this will affect them. I'm going to go ahead and do that in my extension. So basically, Mr. Speaker, to sum up OG's case, what they want to do was take the subsidy from the farmer and leave him penniless, basically, Mr. Speaker, without any state support, and say that, oh, no, don't worry about it. He'll buck up and he'll ensure that his tractor moves faster and he's able to produce more. We don't think that's in any way, anything but senile coming from side OG. But secondly, in terms of are foreign companies better? We think that yes, in some cases foreign companies are better, but we think this is problematic for that rural Indian farmer because these foreign companies, Mr. Speaker, have of course advanced technology. They are able to optimize their supply, and because they have obviously mentioned economies of scale. But let me explain that to you, Mr. Speaker. When they go ahead and process their wheat and their barley in factories, Mr. Speaker, and they're able to go ahead and process much more in a shorter span of time, as compared to the Indian farmer who needs to go to other parties for processing his crops, Mr. Speaker. We think that's problematic. We think that gives these foreign companies an unfair advantage and completely crowds out these local farmers from competition. Secondly, he said Walmart has the ability to buy out local farmers even under our paradigm. No. If you ever read the FDI, the laws in India against FDI in either retail or the rural sector, you would know that that's completely false and not true, Mr. Speaker. We don't think it's important in this debate. Secondly, lastly, he said that India is going to miss out on export. India is going to get access to a larger market when they're able to export to USA because they love that rice. And also Siron talked about how it's problematic because no one wanted to buy it because the only harm coming out from Siron's speech was about how the peace law is going to get harmed. Contextualization. India is not a net exporter of barley or wheat. It is a net exporter of other things, such as spices, such as powders and stuff like that, which you put in your curries over here, Mr. Speaker. We therefore think that given that India's base is not a net exporter of wheat or barley, but in fact it consumes all the wheat and barley that it produces and only exports spices and powders, means that no one's going to suddenly stop importing from India because these exist as unique to India, and that's why people import them in the first place. Moving on to positive matter. First of all, sit down. Moving on to positive matter. How does this work, Mr. Speaker? How does a rural farmer in India work? We think that it's problematic in status quo because we don't think that the government has enough subsidies to give these farmers. So obviously subsidies don't just work by buying rice at a smaller price. We think that's problematic coming from both opening houses to agree to that. The fact that the government subsidizes the grains itself, seeds for these farmers, and gives them handouts in terms of seeds means that these people don't just get subsidies from reducing the price of rice, which pretty much nullifies most of OG's case. But the fact that these people have to resort to money lenders and loan sharks who charge them extremely high rates of interest, Mr. Speaker, which they are not able to pay back because of structural problems in the Indian economy. I'll go ahead and talk about that a bit more later. The fact that there are so many farmer suicides where they go ahead and swallow cyanide simply because they are so much in debt, Mr. Speaker, they cannot support their families, they cannot send their children to school. And for example, if there isn't a monsoon, Mr. Speaker, their crops aren't able to harvest, they're not able to pay back those loan sharks or those money lenders. They have to give back their land to them, Mr. Speaker. We feel that they're forced into a choice where they'd rather commit suicide than go ahead and live that kind of a life. We think that's a problem on the government side over there. They don't have that at all. What we advocate, Mr. Speaker, especially beside closing opposition, is to improve structural problems in the Indian agrarian economy. Given that northern states like Uttar Pradesh and Bihar have large swaths of land which are devoted purely to farming wheat and barley, sit down, devoted purely to farming wheat and barley, Mr. Speaker. The fact that the Indian government, basic thing. Why does India have such a good agrarian economy? It's because India is one of the few countries in the world that has a specific monsoon season. The point over here is, your harvest is after the monsoon season, but you stockpile those grains to go ahead and distribute them around the year so that you don't flood the market and reduce prices completely, Mr. Speaker. The fact that sometimes when they're stockpiling these grains turn rotten because they haven't paid enough attention to them, Mr. Speaker. There's a lesser optimization of production on the part of these farmers. The fact that they don't have access to equipment. But last, in terms of supply management and supply chain management, Mr. Speaker, we don't think that they even plan enough contingency for droughts. We think that under our paradigm, Mr. Speaker, which aren't helped at all just because you allow Walmart or you allow Monsanto to come into India and sell rice. We think it's further exacerbated because these farmers have lesser of an avenue to go ahead and appeal to the government and appeal for support in that sense. Go, closing.
Okay, so tell me this. Given that we've accepted that the peace clause will detriment Indian government, why is it strategic for India to open themselves up to trade embargoes and sanctions?
The peace clause will not detriment India because India does not export wheat and barley. India only exports spice. People still have an incentive to import those things because they're unique to India enough. But the structural problems can only be solved by technology. According to closing government, this transfer of technology was contingent on India opting in the TFA. I think that's false, and it's very simple. Because he said that, oh no, now no one will want to give technology to India because they opt out of the TFA. Just because they operate out of the TFA does not mean they're not going to pay for that technology, or they're not going to employ companies or consultants to come into their country and teach these farmers sustainable farming techniques, Mr. Speaker, and teach these farmers how to better optimize their crop production. We therefore think, Mr. Speaker, that the solution proposed by us is much better. We don't think that their harms are mutually exclusive. But lastly, Mr. Speaker, in terms of a greater geopolitical scale, given that India has recently announced greater cooperation with BRIC countries in terms of Brazil, Russia, India, and China, which have always been traditionally protectionist economies, we think it's an excellent stand for India to take on a geopolitical scale to go ahead and vote against an organization that has traditionally been all pro-Western ideologies when it comes to economy, when it comes to ideas like free trade and removing all subsidies or removing all embargoes. The fact that India profits from these tariffs that it charges to companies and can channel that money into creating those structural reforms is important, Mr. Speaker. But also in terms of taking a stance against something that is traditionally hated with protectionist economies, we're very proud to oppose.
I thank you for that very speech and I'll call upon the panel to conclude the case, decide, and properly.
What is this debate about? This debate is about the action of rejecting the TFA, not about the pros and cons of the TFA, which opposition has been arguing to you since the start of this debate. This debate is about how is it really beneficial if India accepts or rejects the TFA. We see a huge dismissive side from closing opposition. They didn't really respond to any extension from Suron. My speech is going to be like this. Firstly, I'm going to reinforce Suron's extensions, which were clearly dismissed by closing opposition, and then I'm going to deal with closing opposition's clearly complacent extension on seasons, on monsoons, and how does the rural farmer work. Then I'm going to deal with opening opposition later in my speech, and I'm going to conclude to you why our side better explains this debate in the context. So let's look at what Suron explicitly told you, that no one responded to you at all. First, balance, it can be heavily dependent on international trade and exchange in tech. We see no response from them. Secondly, Siddharth, he talked about how India rejecting the TFA activates the peace clause. We see no response from them, and he gave you three harms. Firstly, on how you allow other countries to sanction in India. Secondly, on how other countries will continue to spend their investments and it becomes hard for India to compete with them. And thirdly, on how India will have no exchange in technology when it comes to improving the infrastructure of India as a whole. We see clearly no response, a huge dismissive side from closing opposition. Instead, they decided to only respond to opening government, which has already been responded from opening opposition. Sit down. So let's look at what closing opposition talked about. He said that it wasn't Modi that. He said a factual error of Sharon that it wasn't Modi that was accountable for the act, the act, and it was the Indian Congress that was accountable. It doesn't matter if anyone was accountable. The problem is Modi still is accountable to the act of rejecting the TFA in the first place. And his main extension, sit down, I'll take you later in a bit. His main extension was, how does a rural farmer work? He told you how grains are expensive to subsidize. First response, even if they get the money to subsidize the grains of the farmers, they still are heavily dependent on the exportation of agriculture. That means when they rejected the TFA in the first place, no one wants to trade with them, thus no exportation, no results in exportation for India, thus making India, thus hitting India really hard in the trade section. Sit down. He also talked about how there are seasons that affect these agriculture. How he explained that there are monsoon seasons. Thank you for describing India for us, but they knew all of this before they reached the TFA in the first place. The TFA in the first place a bit later. And then he said that now India has to buy technology to improve their agriculture. Which is better? Let's compare. When India can facilitate better growth because of the TFA, because they accept the TFA in the first place, or when they have to spend more money to buy the technology, especially when you said that the grains were so expensive, and that the whole point of this debate is about subsidization. We still have no clear proving points on closing opposition. Yeah, anyone opening?
Yes, if India accepted the TPA, all those now exist in that same debate. But what is the incentive for the United States of America to cripple the Indian economy through embargoes if they are both thriving trade partners?
We think that if India accepted the TFA in the first place, it wouldn't be really hard for them to facilitate their agriculture in the first place. We think that since they reject it, it becomes extremely hard for them to facilitate as a whole in the first place. So let's look at
I'm just gonna say
Alright. So let's look at what Mirza talked about. He talked about how food security is important for people in India so that they can survive. Yes, we can see that food security is important, and he said that the food amount in India is not optimal, and he said that having food gives you the ability to do your job. Yeah, okay, we can see that food gives you energy, and that food gives you energy to do your job. Yeah, but that's not what the debate is about. Opening opposition and closing opposition only talk about the pros and cons. We give you the main concept. We contextualize the debate for you in a different perspective. This debate is about the evaluation about the action of rejecting the TFA and how it harms India in a really hard or reclassified state. But before 6, Roshan.
Precisely, that's why food security is really important. This debate on our side ensures that we have a sustainable local market in the event where we have to depend on local market. Your side doesn't have a sustainable local market. When people leave, you suffer. How do you survive with that?
We think that people don't live in our paradigm because people live in your paradigm because you don't accept the TFA in the first place. People live in your paradigm because they don't want to export with you anymore. People don't want to export with you anymore, and people don't want to export with you anymore because India is mainly dependent on exportation instead of how does a rural farmer work. So what has closing government proven to you today? What makes us different from four benches of today's debate? We drew you a parallel line from us with side opening government because side opening government only wanted to talk to you about about the pros and cons of rejecting of us accepting the TFA in the first place, what will happen, what are the pros and cons. We drew you a parallel line. We gave you a whole different perspective of what the debate actually is. We gave you an evaluation of what would happen if India actually accepted the TFA in the first place. We think that closing opposition have been clearly dismissive with our extension. Thus, our extension still stands in this debate. We think that this debate is about the evaluation of India accepting the TFA. Thank you.
I think that with the time to conclude the debate, I call upon Dara to close the case for second opposition.
Okay, since we are here to all learn debate, right? See, debates is not just about making fun of the extension that you cannot rebut, and it's not about not taking extension from the team that who is engaging with you, right? But let's I'm going to do a few things for you in this debate. Firstly, I'm going to engage with the non-economic analysis coming from closing costs. Secondly, I'm going to talk about the economic unnecessary analysis coming from opening costs. And thirdly, I'm going to talk about the extension that Akhil talked about. It was very simple. He talked about why Indian economy is unique in its nature, is not compatible with free market values, and when it comes to the describing and characterizing how these farmers actually live, and the pressures and the dilemmas that they face, ladies and gentlemen, and how exactly the agricultural industry works in India, and why we do not need these free trade agreements, why we do not need FTA to be voted, and it's not going to be voted, and it's going to be harmful. This debate is about the pros and cons of FTA, and we have proved to you that there are definitely cons of FTA, and that's why we should reject it, and that's why we should celebrate rejection of it, ladies and gentlemen. Two problems and two things coming from closing government, right? First thing, we are not going to get technology just because we rejected FTA. Bullshit. You can still get technology by negotiating, by buying stuff, by subsidizing your own domestic agriculture, by selling rice to America in exchange, getting technology, ladies and gentlemen. We don't think that's necessarily true. Secondly, now, suddenly, countries are going to embargo India. First question, who would ever want to embargo India, ladies and gentlemen? There is no possibility of a threat, right? But like, okay, even if that's the case, we signed NPT, and after that, they promised us that we are not going to sanction you, and after that, they may still sanction us. Firstly, there is no possibility of a threat. Secondly, what is the blatant promise is something so important that we should consider this debate. Sit down, Sarah, right? Be ashamed of yourself. But let's get at the opening costs, right? The extension coming from opening government, right, is that we need to, right, it's very simple, right? The opening government is just hilarious, right? They tell you that, see, we produce rice, right, and we have a lot of rice. So we have an obligation to import American rice. Firstly, we just have an obligation, no analysis on that. But secondly, to increase competition, right? But they did not necessarily tell us why that competition is necessarily a good thing to happen for the Indian economy. They never proved to us why there is not enough competition when it comes to the domestic level in India. They talked about there is a plethora of farmers producing rice, and they didn't consider the fact that there is already a sort of competition that exists. But why closing opposition ministry? Because we talk to you what exactly happens in the daily life of these farmers, right? The money and the profit that they make is a marginal profit just to ensure the sustainability of their life, to sustainability of their standards of living, and that's the best case scenario, right? You just only get enough money to feed your 2 wives and 10 kids, right? But more than that, the worst case scenario that I can talk about, which is the case most of the time, is because of the economic pressures that exist. You own money, you take loans from money lenders, ladies and gentlemen, and you fail to pay back. These are the sort of things that are unique within the economy of the Indian, right? Well, let's look what happens when you have free trade, because nobody knows how tariffs works, right? It's very simple, right? The moment that you have free trade, like whatever 10% thing that Ciro wanted to talk about because he doesn't understand economic and it didn't make sense. But here's how tariffs works, right? You have tariffs
to ensure that the domestic production it has a comparative advantage in comparison to the foreign production that it comes. Why? Because this is how tariff works. You impose an extra burden, extra money, and extra charge. Meaning that if you have an American rice and an Indian rice in the same equality, because of the tariff, the American rice is going to be more expensive in comparison to the Indian rice. That is sort of comparative advantage that we have on the tariffs. But more importantly, when we have tariffs, that's a source of revenue for the government that we are not going to have under their tariff. That's why tariffs is very important, because it gives a comparative advantage when it comes to the Indian product, because now we have Indian product to be cheaper and more likely to be sold in the huge economy of India, ladies and gentlemen. But secondly, even if we have the sort of the foreign production that comes to the country, so all the diversification point that Ashir what we talk about doesn't exist because they still have them, but the problem is that they are more expensive. I'm not going to take it. They're more expensive. So, but the thing is fine, right? It's okay, because the people who are more wealthy, they end up paying for it, and they pay for tariff. And then later on, we can take the tariff money, the money that we make out of tariff, and then subsidize the domestic production that we have. We think that's necessarily a good thing, and that's something that we should celebrate, ladies and gentlemen. So let's look back at the competition point, right? The moment you remove that tariff and you remove the comparative advantage that your Indian product has, then your Indian product is not unique. The only good thing about Indian product, what is cheapest? But now it's as cheap as any other thing in the market, right? So then what is the advantage for an Indian consumer to go and buy your rice eventually at the end of the day? And we're talking about the farmers who are vulnerable, who are in their place and Jala. And that's why actual extension makes us in this debate, because it's not comfortable. Free market is not comfortable to Indian economy. Right? Before I go through the second part of the debate, go ahead.
So why would farmers then be more efficient through combining assets and hence?
Because they cannot survive, right? Because they don't have a competitive advantage and they die. Simple. Well, let's look at the second part of it, right? The whole season argument that it came from actual extension is very important. Is that traditional economy, it might be bad in the United States, but when it comes to the India, it's actually a good thing. Why? Because this is something that is unique to India and it's not comfortable to any other country. We actually need traditional agriculture because we have shitloads of manual labor that is there to remain unemployed. And we can only keep them employed. And we can only keep them employed if we have manual labor, and if we need manual labor, and if we need traditional economy that exists. So having traditional economy is not necessarily a bad thing very much in the context of India, and it's something that we should celebrate, ladies and gentlemen. Something else that he talked about. He talked about specifically related to the climate and the geography of the India, and how it's season-based, and how harvesting season is something different, and something that only Indians can manage, and only Indians can cater to the needs of the society. But the most important thing, that even they forgot to humiliate it, is that why should we concede to WTO rules and WTO rights? Right? First they come and they impose free trade. What's next? They want to impose the labor rights that they're going to have. They're going to impose more free trades and removing of taxation. See, we are Indian. We cannot afford them. We cannot afford accepting those liberal Western values, ladies and gentlemen. We need to prioritize our economy. We need to prioritize the sustainability of our farmers and the sustainability of agriculture. And that's the only thing that we need to prioritize in this debate. We are very proud to oppose.